Alright, so we're doing a 8480 XAE replacement cover conversion. First thing we're going to start out with is we're going to set the unit at 50% stroke. So we're going to use the manual knob here to adjust the stroke length indicator to 50%. You can see I've already done that. So if we're talking about a PULSA replacement, we're going to do the same thing, only we're going to use the manual adjustment knob and get it set up for 50% stroke. That's where we're going to start. After we're done with that, we're going to go up here to the leader and we're going to remove this polyflow hose. Okay, now we're going to remove this front subcover to access the top of the oscillating housing and the bevel gear. Okay, my subcover screws are out, and now I'm ready to lift off the cover and set it aside. That's going to expose the top of the oscillating housing with the bevel gear and the old shaft or the current shaft, depending on if you're doing a replacement, cover assembly replacement or XAE replacement. So now the mechanical stroke adjustment assembly is set at 50% stroke, and we want to mark one of the teeth on the bevel gear that's on top of the oscillating housing. Just barely see it. I've already started to put a mark here on the housing, and then I'm just going to use a regular paint pen to mark the existing tooth so that I can maintain this 50% position of the mechanical oscillating housing adjustment. So I'm just going to put a little bit of paint on this one tooth so we can set it back where it is, and we can know if we need to move it, we can get it back where it's supposed to be. Okay, so now we're all marked, so we're going to pull the cotter pin that's holding this castle nut on. Make sure we don't drop it in the gearbox, and pull the nut off, and then we're going to pull out this shaft assembly. So get started with that. I'm not going to be able to hold the camera and do that at the same time, so first I'll take the cotter pin out. Okay, cotter pin's out, and I didn't drop it. I'm going to set that aside, and now we're just going to spin off this castle nut. Careful at the end so I don't drop it. There we go. Castle nuts off. There we go. It popped off, so make sure I don't drop that either. And take that guy off. Alright. Set him aside. Alright, so now the round portion of this shaft will pull right out of the bearing portion of the oscillating housing. This bevel gear that you see right here is also runs on a pin that goes through this shaft. So we want to be careful about a couple things when we take this assembly off. We want to make sure that we don't lose the bevel gear down in the gearbox. Pull this out evenly, and we don't lose the pin on this universal joint assembly. So that's next. Once we get that done, then actually we're going to pull the cover screws off. So we're going to take this back subcover off. There are 6 screws that hold it on. We'll take those out and pull the entire assembly, and when we pull that, this shaft assembly will come out. Okay, so now I've taken all the cover screws out except for this one that's on the side of the pump that I'm working on. So everything else is out, and the reason for that is that the XAE or PULSA or whatever's hanging off the back of this is going to be back end heavy. So as soon as I take this front screw out, this entire assembly is going to try to tip up. So this is really a two-man job to get the cover off. So it's really best if you can have one person in the back of the pump that's going to support the XAE, and that's a majority of the weight, or the PULSA, whichever one you're working with, in the back, and then have a second person in the front, and the second person in the front is going to handle the shaft and this bevel gear and make sure that we don't lose those when this comes out. So we're going to take the cover, we're going to pull the entire assembly up and off the back, and when we do that, this shaft will come with the PULSA or the XAE and pull out of this bearing, and we'll keep this bevel gear is going to have to stay in place because it's held by this other bevel gear, so it won't slide off with this shaft subassembly. Okay, so you can see how my cover assembly now is tipped up. I've got to support it in the back because I don't have somebody here to hold that for me, but so now you can see how the assembly is starting to pull out of the front bearing and through the bevel gear. You can also see how my adjustment has shifted a little bit when I disconnected those two, and that's why we marked that so that we can reset that back where we want it. So now I'm going to pull the rest of this front round shaft assembly out and pull this entire cover assembly off, and then I'll flip it over and we can see what the back side looks like. Okay, now I've got the cover positioned so that I can pull this front end of the shaft assembly out of the bevel gear. You can see the pin arrangement here, and there's a sleeve. So I want to make sure I don't lose the pin or the sleeve when I pull this out. So I pull it out of the gear, and then you can see the bevel gear on front of the oscillating housing. So I'm going to just lift that out. So that's just going to lift off of that face, and you can see the two slots that that shear pin engages. And so now I'm going to put this aside, and I'm going to pull the rest of this assembly out. Okay, I've removed the cover from the top of the pump, and I've got it over on the bench. We'll go over the bench. Alright, my cover assembly is on the bench now. I've got XAE on this end. I've got coupling shaft and universal joint shaft with the round end that goes into the top of the oscillating housing and the bevel gear there. You can see the counter here and the meshing gears, and then you'll see how the shaft pulls out of this coupling and just pulls straight out like this, and so it's just a square ended shaft, and same thing with the coupling, square opening. So at this point, if we're going to replace the XAE, we're going to pull the shaft. We're going to remove these 4 socket head cap screws. They will decouple the XAE from the back side of the cover. We're going to keep the spacer and the gasket that's included and reuse those with the new assembly. As long as they're not leaking. If they're leaking, then we're going to replace them. Reinstall the XAE once it's been aligned to the 50% position, and then retighten the 4 screws, and replace the shaft, either new or reuse the existing, and then bring the cover assembly over for installation on top of the pump. Alright, I want to talk a little bit about how the bevel gear goes on the end of this universal joint shaft. So here I have the shaft, and we can see the hole here for the roll pin. I'm sorry, for the harden pin, it's not a roll pin. And we start with this, it's a little tricky for me to do this one-handed, but I'll do my best. We start with this spacer collar, and we align the roll pin hole with the hole in the spacer collar, and then we have a hardened pin that actually mates those two, and try to get that aligned properly, and see if I can do this one-handed. Might be a little tricky, so I'm just gonna insert that pin all the way through till it comes out on the other side. I can't really show you a good picture of that, I'm sorry, but we'll see that it projects on both sides just a little bit, certainly less than an eighth, probably closer to a 16th. Now if you look at the bevel gear, you'll notice that it has these 2 slots, one on each side. So The trick with the bevel gear is the bevel gear has to be mounted on the pump in the oscillating housing like this, so that when the adjustment shaft is brought in, the pin gets aligned with the two slots, and then we can add the brass washer, castle nut, and the cotter pin. So that's how this assembly goes, and I've got this all set to go. So the next step will be to take the cover assembly over to the top of the pump and to install the shaft and align the bevel gear and complete the assembly. So I've got my oscillating housing ready to go. I've got my spacer shaft and hardened pin in place, and I'm going to orient the cover. I'm going to bring the cover forward while I feed the shaft through the bevel gear and the oscillating housing bearing block. Now the important thing is to get the alignment of the bevel gear with the pin, and you're going to have to do that ahead of time. One of the nice things is with the XAE square shaft is that you can pull the shaft in and out a little bit, so that helps you to orient that properly before the two engage. Just grab my screwdriver here. Okay, so I've got one of the cover screws in. I've got the cover kind of aligned to the top of the pump here, and I've fed the adjustment shaft through the bearing block and through the bevel gear. So one of the things we should talk about is lubrication. So at this point in the reassembly process, we really want to make sure that we grease the backside of this bevel gear. General purpose grease will be fine. The face of this, the bevel gear teeth down below on top of the oscillating housing, and then the bore and the back face of the oscillating housing where the brass washer will run. Just better to have those pre-lubricated before we get running, and so recommend that you liberally apply grease in those locations. So generally the procedure is to rotate the bevel gear. You basically lift it up and you turn it and re-engage the gears, and then lower it into the lower bevel gear, right? And then once we have it aligned, we can take our shaft and we can slide it in, and if everything lines up properly, the pin will slide into the slot on the bevel gear, and then we're all set to add our brass washer and castle nut. All the way in. Okay, the shaft's all the way in, and now I can add my brass washer here to this end, and then I can bring in my castle nut and not drop that into the gearbox. So be real careful about that. You want to go fishing. And now we're going to tighten this until we're fully tight. We'll make sure we keep alignment of our mark here on our bevel gear. And okay, so now we got to install the cotter pin. So we're going to get a hand tightened. Now we're going to back it off just one position until we get alignment of one of the through holes. And I don't know if you can see it, but there's a vertical through hole that lines up with this slot in the castle nut. That's where my roll pin's going to go. Okay, so the brass washer and castle nut are on. Now we're going to insert the cotter pin. So we'll get the cotter pin here, both sides, and then we're just going to splay the other end, which you can't really see and I can't really do one-handed, but I think you've got the idea. And then that completes the assembling. Next we'll put the cover screws in, and we note that we've got a 50% on our dial indicator, and we're still maintaining our 50% position on the stroke adjustment mechanism, so that's good. Cover screws, then we'll restore the bleeder line to the front of the pump, put the oil indicator back in, the level indicator, and then we'll run the XAE from 0 to 100% using signal control to assure that it matches the dial indicator and we have full adjustment of the stroke adjustment mechanism. Okay, I've got my cover screws back in, and now I'm gonna put my dipstick back, and I'm gonna restore my bleeder line to the front of the pump. Before I replace my sub cover, I'm going to set up the XAE to operate, because I'd like it to run through the course, and I can watch my oscillating housing block go up and down, and I can be sure that everything is turning correctly and functioning as I expect it to. So that's my next step. I've got my signal generator attached, and so now I'm going to take it out of manual and put it into auto, and make sure that my bevel gears are meshing correctly, that we're not too tight, everything's turning nice and freely, and that the dial indicator is working as I would expect it to. Make sure that I don't have any blockages at the ends of the travel. Usually the 0 or the 100% position, if we've done something wrong with setting up the counter or marrying the XAE to the cover, typically if there is a problem, it would manifest itself by this assembly stopping because the block that's running inside the housing reaches its mechanical stop and can't go any further, and the XAE can't overpower that. So I'm going to wait for this to move all the way to 0. We just came up on the 0% position. I've stopped. My counter indicator looks good, and I'm feeding 4 milliamps, and everything looks good. I didn't come up against any hard mechanical stops, so success. So now we're going to go to the 20 milliamp setting from here, and we're going to head our way up and check the 100% position. So headed that way right now. Okay, we're coming up on 100 here. Everything's looking good. Didn't have any hard stops. Just zeroing in on the 100 right now. And just making some fine adjustments. It's looking good. Alright, didn't encounter any mechanical stops, so this one looks good. Now the next thing we'll do is replace this forward sub cover, and then we'll operate the pump and make sure that we can cover the range while the pump's at pressure. Okay, the sub cover is back on and the pump is ready for operation. We're ready to roll. This conversion replacement is complete. So thank you for your attention.